Chapter-9. Stepford, Connecticut. I still remember when there was just one boat. All that blue water everywhere and just one boat with two crazy kids pulling on oars. Every time I think about it, it makes me smile. Howard Winklevoss was leaning against the white wooden fence, elbows on the top rail. What was left of his distinguished-looking white hair shifted in the breeze, and his aviator-style glasses shielded his eyes from the glare of the mid-morning sun. Although Tyler was a good head taller than his father, at 69 his dad was still such a large presence in his life. He felt 15 again, peering down to where the meandering coastline of Long Island Sound intersected with the parks surrounding them. The view from the peak of Todd's Point, a sprawling 2.6-mile network of dirt trails, picnic areas, and parkland that was also the original site of the town of Greenwich, Connecticut, purchased from the Sinoway Indians for the princely sum of 25 fur coats in 1640, was like a painter's palette before the brush touched it and broke the colors at their seams. The yellows, greens, and blues were still intact. Bright sand, lush grass, crystal water. Tyler could make out at least 7 boats cutting across the current, white against the blue, the young men and women within the boats little more than blurs of synchronized motion. "It's still surreal seeing so many boats," Tyler said. The fact that the boats were out on the water, that the sport of rowing was growing and thriving in Greenwich, engaging hundreds of people every year, meant something to Tyler and his family, because it was something they had helped build from scratch. He and Cameron often thought of Crew as their first real startup. Those kids were out there on the water because Tyler and his brother had taken a risk years ago. "It looks so easy from up here, doesn't it?" his father continued. "All the complexity, the hard work, the pain, the physics, hidden beneath the calm surface and all that beauty." Tyler smiled. He looked over at Cameron. He knew they were both thinking the same thing. This was the way their father always saw the world. Everything in terms of the math behind it. Howard Winklevoss couldn't just look at boats on the water. He saw mechanical centers of gravity, torque, leverage, and thrust versus drag, friction, all of it combining to create balance, harmony. That was how his mind worked, always seeking to turn reality into mathematical problems that could be solved. Chaos into order. A sort of reverse entropy. Howard Winklevoss hadn't been born in a place like Greenwich, Connecticut. He was a true American success story. He'd bootstrapped himself and the whole Winklevoss line up into the upper class by way of that mathematical, gifted mind. Howard Winklevoss's great-grandfather, August Winklevoss, the twins' great-great-grandfather, was a coal miner, a transplant from Hanover, Germany, who had settled in Pennsylvania Dutch country and then promptly died of black lung. His son, the twins' great-grandfather, became a coal miner at age 8. Toward the end of his years, he had a permanently fused L-shaped back resulting from a life spent bent over, digging coal in caves and shafts with a heavy pick balanced over one shoulder. His brother, the twins' great-uncle, had lost a leg in a mining accident when a minecart ran over it. His mangled leg was sawed right off on the family kitchen table by a county doctor. Howard Winklevoss Sr., the twins' grandfather, hadn't been a miner his whole life, but he had started out as one. A self-taught mechanic, he had helped a wealthy man whose car had serendipitously broke down on a road nearby, his family homestead in Mercer, Pennsylvania, where he lived with his parents and 11 siblings, 6 brothers and 5 sisters. This wealthy man paid him so handsomely for fixing his car that day that Howard Sr. was inspired to leave the coal mines behind and start fixing cars full-time. Eventually, with the man's help, he put together just enough money from his mining days to open a makeshift garage with his brothers, earning themselves the nickname Barnyard Garagemen. Howard Sr.'s father, the twins' great-grandfather, was very upset at the time because he thought horses were far superior to the auto. You could rely on them. They didn't break down, and cars wouldn't work in the field. But eventually, Howard Sr. would go on to start multiple businesses, including a general store. Howard Jr., the twins' father, had picked up a love for automobiles and an entrepreneurial spirit from his father, and had nearly flunked out of high school because he'd spent all his free time building a Model A Ford from scratch. He would work at his father's general store each day after school, then, after dinner, would work on the homemade car until late in the evening. Everyone around him had told him he was crazy and that it would never pass the Pennsylvania inspection requirements. He'd scrounged parts and pieces from junkyards, garage sales, and mail-order catalogs, obsessed with getting the Model A perfect, down to the very last nut and bolt. He'd finished the car in 2 years and managed to pass state inspection, making it road legal. But he barely survived his high school exams. Nonetheless, he drove his chopped and channeled hot rod down to Penn State and rolled into the admissions office looking for a spot. The older lady behind the desk took one glance at his transcript and sent him packing. Undeterred, he headed to Grove City College, where he managed to impress their admissions director with what he had built. At Grove City College, 2 important things happened. He continued to develop the entrepreneurial skills that he had learned from his father, and he met his future wife, Carol Leonard. During freshman week in 1961, Howard and his parents were in line for registration in front of Carol and her parents. Carol's mother, Mildred, playfully pointed out the handsome guy in front of them to Carol. Unknown to Carol at the time, Howard's parents had pointed out the attractive blonde girl behind them to Howard. A month later, when Howard and Carol phoned home, they both had, you'll never guess, conversations with their parents. From then on, Howard and Carol were a picture-perfect match in a 1960s collegiate, post-war kind of way. Carol, the daughter of a New York Police Department detective and a schoolteacher from New Hyde Park, Long Island, was a reserved prom queen who was more comfortable following the rules than breaking them. She was a quick study and possessed a wisdom of universal truths that you'd find in the Book of Proverbs, a book that, along with the Bible, her mother often quoted. Howard was a handsome, athletic, and confident, bordering on cocky, upstart who was comfortable taking risks and getting creative with the rules. Together, they were the perfect team. When he wasn't spending time with Carol or his fraternity brothers, Howard was spending time on his entrepreneurial endeavors. He paid his way through Grove City selling pots and pans door to door. Soon he was hiring his fraternity brothers and running a mini cookware empire. Upon graduation, Howard decided he wanted to study business and better himself. Learning that San Jose State in California charged only $49.50 per credit and had few, if any, entry requirements, he headed west. At San Jose, the master's degree in business administration, MBA, program was already full, so Howard settled on studying for a master's degree in insurance, with the intention of working his way into the MBA program the following year. At San Jose, and then even more so as he continued his studies, chasing a PhD at the University of Oregon, his love for building mechanical things transferred over to the new science of early computing. It was in Oregon that a summer course in pensions, a mathematically complex area of business so obscure at the time that he was the only student that registered for the class, would change the direction of his life. An innovative computer simulation he created to compare different ways to calculate pensions led to a professorship at the Wharton School, as well as a groundbreaking book, Pension Mathematics, with numerical illustrations. Meanwhile, Carol earned a master's degree and doctorate degree in education at the University of Pennsylvania, in between continuing to teach elementary school. Eventually, Howard would leave Wharton to start a consulting firm. He hired a number of his brightest students to join him, the ones who didn't spend their time building cars and selling pots and pans. Even though Howard's consulting firm, Winklevoss Consultants, had its office in Philadelphia, he was on the road so much making sales pitches and interacting with clients that he could have just lived about anywhere in the United States, as long as it was close enough to a major airport. After living in Philadelphia for over 13 years, he and Carol, looking for a change, decided on raising their young family in Palo Alto, California. Back then, Palo Alto wasn't widely referred to as Silicon Valley. Its gorgeous weather and the fact that many of Howard's relatives had moved from dreary Pennsylvania to settle there and start their own families made it an ideal place. As a young family, they enjoyed the beautiful town, the wonderful parks, and the excitement of nearby Stanford University. Cameron and Tyler were so devoted to the playground at the end of the street where they lived that every day, rain or shine, they piled their toys into wagons and hauled them down the street to the playground. While Howard worked in the home office above the garage or was on the road starting to build his empire, Carol focused on raising young children and volunteering in the local community. Howard often remarked to his children that he owed all of his success in life to his wife. This was especially true in terms of raising his family. A few years later, Howard sold his company to Johnson & Higgins, one of the largest insurance companies in the world and located in New York, and he and Carol moved their family to Greenwich, Connecticut, a nearby suburb. Howard worked for Johnson & Higgins as a senior vice president for 2 years, commuting between New York and Greenwich, but ultimately decided he was an entrepreneur at heart. So, in 1987, at the age of 44, he decided to start all over again and found a new company called Winklevoss Technologies. This company would be different from that last one. Instead of being hired as a consultant by a company to conduct a complex pension study and then deliver the finished product, Howard and his team would build the software necessary to run such studies and then sell it to companies so they could conduct the studies themselves. Winklevoss Technologies would be a software provider instead of a consultant shackled to the billable hour. At the time, the desktop personal computer was a brand new idea. Howard's new company would bet on the nascent technology of personal computing rapidly growing, improving, and exploding with adoption. It was the kind of risk that he couldn't have taken without Carol's unwavering encouragement and support. After school, the twins would often go to their father's office and do their homework. In between schoolwork, they would explore the office, talk with the software engineers, read the computer magazines lying around, play on the computers, and watch from the inside how a technology company worked. Cameron and Tyler literally grew up inside of a startup, before startups were even a thing. The Winklevoss house was not a jock household in the traditional sense. While everyone was active and played sports, the dinner table conversations were not dominated by discussions of topics like the score of the Yankees game. Instead, Howard enjoyed talking about the things that he was passionate about most: business, technology, computers, math, financial markets. While Carol rounded out the conversation with topics like literature, film, human interest, culture, and the arts. Howard and Carol were both intellectual heavyweights in their own unique way, and together they covered a huge swatch of knowledge and wisdom. Cameron and Tyler's role models growing up were not sports figures. They were startup founders like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, the people who were in the business magazines they read in their father's office and who, like their father, were trying to change the world through technology. While Howard taught his children everything he knew about business, Carol ensured they got a much broader education in life. She was determined to provide them with the opportunity to find their passion, wherever it might lie. Although Tyler and his brother had been raised in a family that now had money, their parents never let them lose touch with their family history, and not just their father's coal mining ancestry. Carol's forebearers were also German immigrants who came to the United States in the 19th century with nothing but their dreams. Carol's grandfather was a fireman and hotelier in Rockaway Beach. Her uncle served in the U.S. Army during World War II and fought in the Pacific Ocean Theater, and her father was a homicide detective. Like Howard's family, Carol's family embodied good Christian morals and believed that a person's word meant something. Howard and Carol had grown up believing that the world was a place where honesty and the ability to work hard were respected above all else. Winning was not what mattered. What mattered was that you gave your best effort and conducted yourself with the highest integrity and character. As Howard Sr. had always told his son, I don't care how many follow in my tracks. I just want to be the first person making footprints in the snow." "I remember when you and Cameron first started out," Tyler's dad said. "Everyone looked at you cross-eyed, leaving campus and disappearing off into the woods to row." Tyler laughed. He and his brother hadn't grown up in coal country, far from it, but that didn't keep them from cutting their own path, or trying to create those first footprints in the metaphorical snow. Two overly tall, identical kids stood out in the Lord of the Flies atmosphere of high school, and not always in a good way. Being obsessed with Latin, computers, and building web pages didn't exactly help. Nor did studying classical piano for 12 years, or teaching themselves how to code in HTML. The twins of this era were a far cry from the final club's jock stereotype Mark Zuckerberg would later peg them as being at Harvard. But a quirk of geography had led them to the passion that eventually dominated their early life and changed their standing in the local, athletically centered community. It had all started with their next-door neighbor, a kid named Ethan Ayer, who was 6'9" and 10 years older than the twins. He had gone to boarding school at Andover, which had one of the best rowing programs in the country. He would later go on to row at Harvard and then Cambridge University. When he'd come home to visit, he'd told these great stories about rowing, about being out on the water, competing with other rowers from all over the world. Tyler and Cameron had been intrigued. Their mother had started checking the local yellow pages and realized there were no rowing programs in Greenwich. Even though there was water everywhere and adults in town who had rowed back in boarding school and college, there weren't any local rowing programs for Tyler and Cameron to join. Calling marina after marina, their mother was told that the only rowing they did was when a motorboat ran out of gas. Still, she'd persisted and eventually found a rowing club in Westport, Connecticut, 30 miles north. One summer day in August of 1996, she packed up the twins in the car and drove them to what turned out to be an abandoned wooden building, the original Westport train station, with a rowing club squatting inside. This humble club, sitting on the banks of the Saugatuck River, had been founded by an Irishman named James Mangan a few years earlier. The twins entered the long wooden boathouse and, not finding anyone inside, made their way down the overgrown path to the water. There, in the middle of the path, they first ran into Mangan. When his eyes locked onto the two of them, 15-year-old mirror-identical twins, already well over 6 feet tall and growing, he'd broken out in an ear-to-ear grin. He'd made some comment in his thick Irish brogue about God dropping them on his front porch, a righty and a lefty who were exactly the same, growing every day. He immediately agreed to train them. When they'd first started, they weren't really sure what the hell they had gotten themselves into. The old train station had no running water, no electricity, no heat, and you had to be careful where you stepped or you might fall right through the floor. The nearest locker room was the restaurant in the mobile station across the street. On their first day on the water, in an old, rickety practice shell that was partly held together with duct tape, Tyler and his brother managed to take a total of 11 strokes. Mangan, grinning the whole time, told them that one day they would take hundreds, sometimes more than 1,000, in a single practice. And never mind the duct tape or the condition of the hull. This sport wasn't about the chariot. It was about the horse. Most importantly, the boat didn't care who you were, where you were from, the size of your wallet. It cared only about what you did. "We thought you were nuts when you said you weren't going out for any varsity teams," Howard said. "I thought your mom was nuts when she made me put an ergometer in the attic." Tyler winced, remembering the brutal training device, more akin to a medieval torture machine, and how many winters he had spent up in that attic, pulling the chain on that mechanical monster. But it was the ergometer that had pointed them toward the Olympics. Every month, teenagers from across the country would submit their 20-minute erg test results to U.S. Rowing, which would post them to the U.S. Rowing website. When Tyler and Cameron discovered that their own scores were in the top 10 in the country for their age, they realized that there was a possibility they could compete on an entirely different level. They then decided to lobby their private school's headmaster to create a varsity rowing program, the first ever in Greenwich. With the help of their father, they'd found a slip at a nearby dock in Long Island Sound and convinced a few of their classmates to sign up. The twins were two kids who had known nothing about the sport, who had trained and sweated, partially in their attic, until they were good enough to compete at the national level, making the U.S. Junior National Rowing Team and competing in the 1999 Junior World Championships in Bulgaria. Then they'd built their first startup, a high school varsity rowing team, from scratch. That startup had helped them get into Harvard via early admission, because the twins weren't simply athletes, they were the definition of scholar athletes, polymaths who had proven their mettle in both the classroom and on the water. And building their startup would put them on the strange path into another world where they were also starting from scratch. To them, the art of crew really was a microcosm of startup life. It had taught them how to work on a team and succeed under pressure, where the difference between winning and losing could be razor thin. Cameron had often remarked that some of the best lessons in his life he had learned at the boathouse, and they had very little, if anything, to do with the sport of rowing. Tyler pivoted the conversation to the reason he and his brother had invited their father to Todd's Point. "We know more about Bitcoin right now than we knew at 15, when we took the leap into rowing. That was a big decision then, and this feels like a big decision now." Tyler had always relied on his father for business advice and mentorship, not only because his father was a legitimate mathematical genius who had built a successful consulting company the same way he'd built a Model A Ford in high school, from the ground up, but also because he still considered his father to be the most ethical, high-integrity person he'd ever known. Maybe it was the coal country in the man, but Howard Winklevoss Jr. was the one who had taught them that right and wrong mattered, that a handshake was more important than any contract a lawyer could draw up. When the situation with Zuckerberg had first gone down, their father had been the most shocked of any of them about how the young Facebook CEO had acted. He wasn't a naive man, but he couldn't process how someone could behave so deceitfully and with such disrespect. He'd supported Tyler and Cameron in their efforts to make things right, even when they'd turned down the cash settlement in favor of Facebook stock. And to them, it didn't matter how many lawyers had told them they were being fools. The fact that their father had stood behind them gave them the confidence to realize they were making the right decision. Cameron said it first. "This is either complete bullshit or the next big thing," Tyler said. His father nodded, looking out at the water. They'd already discussed Bitcoin at length, on the phone and during breakfast that morning. His father had immediately seen the mathematical beauty behind the now 3-year-old cryptocurrency. The elegance of the blockchain, the open, decentralized ledger where transactions were permanently recorded, immediately made sense to him, and the brilliance of Bitcoin itself, of a currency backed by math and cryptography, with a fixed supply mined by computers running complex equations, certainly thrilled his mathematical mind. But he shared Tyler and Cameron's concerns about Silk Road and the shady side of the Bitcoin world. "I think Bitcoin is worth a deeper dive, but BitInstant is a bigger question. This kid, Charlie, is going to be a handful." "It's not just him building BitInstant," Tyler said. "There's his head of marketing and his seed investor. A libertarian philosopher and an anarchist." "I don't think Roger Ver is an anarchist. I think he calls himself an individualist." "I read my fair share of Ayn Rand in college, but someone needs to actually be in charge, grab hold of the reins, and make sure this thing doesn't start to veer sideways. Someone needs to handle compliance, hire people, run the day-to-day, to manage the risks and deal with the legal side of things. Right now, all of that falls on this Charlie kid, and that's who you'd really be investing in. Not the business plan or the philosophy. A kid running the show." Tyler knew his father was right, that they wouldn't be investing in just the idea, but in the person, the entrepreneur. That was what it meant to be a venture capitalist. "He's smart. He's ambitious. He's got something to prove," Cameron said. They were good starting points, but Charlie also seemed to be swayed by Voorhees' philosophies and taken with Veer's apparent ideology. Something he'd said had been worrisome. "We don't really need to care what people do with their Bitcoin." It had almost been a throwaway comment, but it had stuck with them. From a business perspective, it made sense. BitInstant was an addendum to an exchange. It was just a way to help people get Bitcoin for cash. But from a philosophical perspective, it was a fairly dangerous statement. Libertarians or individualists believe people should be free to do whatever they wanted with their money. But in reality, people had never been free to do whatever they wanted with their money. There were laws, regulations, criminal statutes. Bitcoin was young and at the moment unregulated, but for a limited time only. Eventually, governments were going to care very much what people did with their Bitcoin. With BitInstant, they really would be betting on Charlie. It would be a risk. But wasn't that exactly what they were in the business of doing? Taking risks? Wasn't that exactly what they were looking for? The chance to take a risk on something with immense potential? To be part of a revolution once again, only this time with no Mark Zuckerberg. Even their mathematical father had to agree. A second act with the enormous potential of Bitcoin seemed like it was worth the risk. It wasn't often you got a second chance to catch lightning in a bottle. An hour later, Tyler was sitting next to his brother in their SUV as Cameron scrolled toward a contact on his cell phone. Tyler had the window rolled down next to him so he could feel the breeze against his cheeks. Their father was still at the end of the trail, leaning over Todd's Point, watching the boats row past. He and their mother came down to the point often, and not just to reminisce about the twins and their rowing. The point had also been a favorite place of Tyler and Cameron's older sister, Amanda, who in many ways had embodied the best qualities of both Tyler and his twin brother. She was a brilliant student, star athlete, charismatic actress with almost limitless energy. Her talent while they were growing up easily overshadowed theirs. But most importantly, she was grace personified. A rising star when she went off to Williams College, suddenly she started suffering from debilitating bouts of depression. The family was deeply concerned about her well-being and tried to figure out what was going on. It was a hellish 2-year journey into the world of mental health. They were suddenly in a land that science didn't understand, where syncing up a diagnosis with the right treatment was like hitting a piñata blindfolded while walking around the Grand Canyon. It was also a deeply private struggle they faced. Almost no one outside the family knew what was going on, and most wouldn't understand. This was not a broken arm, not something you could point to and easily process. This was the unknown, filled with stigma. At times, on her road to recovery, she sought relief from her pain through drugs, which ultimately took her life in New York in June 2002. She was 23. She was never going to have her chance to catch lightning in a bottle. Because her tragic end had taken place in a public setting, on a rainy night around midnight on June 14th, she'd slipped and fallen on the steps of a trailer on the set of a Robert De Niro movie being filmed in Chelsea. The New York Post immediately ran several fabricated stories thrusting the tragedy into the tabloid sphere. It was a cruel airing of a private struggle that mischaracterized their fight, and more important, who their daughter was. A star who burned brightly on Earth, but was now flying high in the sky. In one of those stars I shall be living. In one of them I shall be laughing. And so it will be as if all the stars were laughing when you look at the sky at night. Prince Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, The Little Prince. The words of her favorite book were inscribed on her tombstone. Tyler and Cameron had been young, 20 years old, rising college juniors who spent most of their time rowing and thinking up business ideas in their dorm room. It had been a devastating time for them and for their parents. Amanda was the only person in the entire world, including their parents, who had never mixed them up, always telling Cameron and Tyler apart perfectly. When they made the Olympics, they named their racing shell in her honor. as they raced at the Olympic Games in Beijing, beating medalists on their way to making the grand final in their first international regatta, a feat almost unheard of. Amanda's spirit was with them. And it had been only 2 years after Amanda's passing that the twins would be thrust into the torturous and circuitous series of events that had led them to where they were today. "You ready to do this?" Cameron asked as his finger hovered over the contact on his phone. Tyler nodded. To the outside world, it looked like things had always come easily to them. But Tyler knew that wasn't true. The thing their father and his history and their own family hardships had taught them was that it wasn't about whether things came easily or hard. It was how you faced them. If you went down, you got back up. And if you had a chance to do something great, you took it. Cameron hit the number. "So?" David Azar's Brooklynese reverberated through the car. "Are we going to do this thing?" "Draw up the contract," Tyler said. What Azar didn't know was that the $800,000 investment they were about to make in BitInstant was nothing compared to what Tyler and Cameron had planned. "Fantastic! And guys, I got a perfect name for our investment group. You ready? McGuire Investments. Get it? Jerry Maguire. Show me the money!" Cameron pressed the mute button and looked at Tyler. "We can still change our minds," he said. Tyler laughed. In his mind, they'd already pulled the trigger.